I've been trying to figure out where to start this for a while now. You could start it with the phone call, I guess, or you could start it earlier, with the 11 years that made me the kind of person who picks up the phone when a number he doesn't recognize calls at 6:45 in the morning. Either way, you end up in the same place. So, the phone call. It was a Tuesday. I remember that because I'd just gotten back from a job in Tbilisi the Friday before, and I'd spent the weekend doing nothing in particular. Laundry, bad coffee, staring at the ceiling of my apartment in a way that felt like rest but probably wasn't. By Tuesday, I was already restless. That's the honest version. When the call came in, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I'd let go cold, and I picked up on the second ring. The man on the other end introduced himself as Hargrove Solutions. Not a name, just the company, which told me something about how the conversation was going to go. He had the voice of someone who made a lot of calls like this one. Smooth, unhurried, no wasted words. He said they had a situation in Ukraine. A research team had gone dark inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone near Pripyat. They needed a 4-man extraction unit to go in, locate the missing personnel, and bring them out. Quietly. No military involvement, no Ukrainian government oversight, nothing official touching it from any direction. I asked who the research team was working for. He said that information would be available to the team leader upon contract execution. That's a way of saying, not yet, that sounds like soon. I've heard it before. I asked about the timeline. He said they needed boots on the ground within 72 hours. I didn't say yes right away. I want to be clear about that, not because it changes anything, but because I've thought about this enough times that I need to be accurate. I sat with it for maybe 30 seconds. 30 seconds of actually thinking it through. The zone, the exclusion perimeter, the checkpoint situation, the logistics of a quiet extraction from a site that had been technically off limits for the better part of 4 decades. It was complicated. I knew it was complicated. But I'd done complicated before and come out the other side. And 11 years of that had a way of making complicated feel like something you just work through rather than something you walk away from. I said I'd need to see the briefing materials before I committed. He said they'd be in my inbox in 20 minutes. They were there in 15, which, looking back, probably should have told me something too. The briefing was thin. Coordinates, a site description, the Jupiter factory, a Soviet-era electronics complex on the eastern edge of Pripyat, a last known contact date, and a note about the checkpoint at Daityatki being prearranged. That phrase, prearranged, was doing a lot of work in a very small space. What it meant was that someone had already paid the guards. What it implied was that this kind of thing had been done before, or at least that someone had thought carefully enough about doing it to know which palms needed greasing and how much. I called Louis first. Louis Thompson and I had worked together going back to a corporate security contract in Lagos, and before that he'd been Army, communications and signals, the kind of guy who could pull a usable data signal out of a building that looked like it had been bombed twice and flooded once. He was good at his job in the specific way that mercenary people are good at their jobs, efficiently without sentiment, with one eye always on what the job was going to pay. He said yes before I'd finished explaining it, which was either a testament to how much he trusted my read on things or a sign that he'd also been sitting around getting restless. Probably both. William Buck took a little longer to reach. He didn't carry his phone like it was attached to him. When he picked up, he listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when I was done, he said, "Okay." Just that. William was former Navy, a medic, and he communicated in the smallest units of language he could get away with. I'd worked with him twice before, and I trusted him completely, which is a thing I don't say about many people. He'd been in situations that would have made most men loud and reactive, and he'd stayed quiet through all of them. That kind of stillness is either a character trait or something you earn the hard way. With William, I suspected it was both. The fourth slot was Hargrove's addition, Jerome Kelly, a Ukrainian national, 42 years old, local hire. Hargrove's description of him was that he'd grown up near the zone and had been working as a guide for researchers and journalists for years, that he knew the terrain between the checkpoint and Reactor 4 better than any map currently in existence. That last part was probably true. Maps of the zone went out of date fast. Buildings collapsed, roads flooded. The whole place was in a slow process of being reclaimed by something that didn't care about human schedules. A man who'd been walking those streets for years was worth more than any satellite image. I didn't love the idea of a fourth man I hadn't vetted myself, but I didn't push back hard enough on it, and that's on me. We assembled at Daityatki on a gray Tuesday morning, the sky the color of old concrete, the air cold enough that you could see your breath but not cold enough to be genuinely uncomfortable, just cold enough to remind you where you were. The checkpoint guards were exactly what the briefing had promised. They looked at us, looked at something one of them was holding that I assumed was a phone, and waved us through without a word. No inspection, no paperwork, no record of us passing through at all, presumably. That's what pre-arranged looks like in practice. Jerome was already on the other side of the checkpoint when we came through, standing at the edge of the road with his hands in the pockets of a heavy canvas jacket, watching us the way you watch something you've been waiting on. He shook hands with each of us in turn, gave his name, and then turned and started walking without waiting to be asked. Confident. He knew where he was going, and he wanted us to know he knew. I fell into step and watched him. He moved through the overgrown streets of Pripyat the way someone moves through a place they've memorized, not looking at things so much as tracking them peripherally, checking angles without appearing to check them, adjusting his path around obstacles before they were fully visible from where I was standing. That part was exactly what Hargrove had sold him as. The man knew this ground, but there was something else underneath it, a tightness in the way he held his shoulders, the way he'd glance back, not at us, but past us like he was measuring distance from something behind us, rather than checking on the team. It wasn't fear, exactly. Or it wasn't only fear. It was more like a man who had agreed to something and was now doing the arithmetic on whether he'd agreed correctly. I filed it away. Told myself it was just the zone. Some people got that way in the zone. It had a quality to it, the silence and the overgrowth and the buildings standing empty with their windows knocked out, that put a particular kind of pressure on a person's nerves. I'd read about it. Stalkers, the locals called the people, who came in here unofficially. Jerome had probably brought dozens of them through. Maybe the pressure built up over time. That's what I told myself. I kept walking, and I watched him, and I kept telling myself that. And somewhere ahead of us, the Jupiter factory was waiting, and the research team that had gone dark was in there somewhere. And I still thought I knew what kind of job this was. The Jupiter factory announced itself before we saw it. You could smell it, not radiation, that's not how radiation works, but the smell of a building, that size going back to nature, wet concrete and rust and something underneath that I'd call mold, except it was too sharp for mold, more like the inside of a battery. We came around the corner of what had been a residential block, and there it was, running the full length of the street, and then some 4 stories of Soviet brutalism, with the windows mostly blown out and the facade stained in long vertical streaks, where rain had been working on it for 35 years. The overgrowth had gotten into it, birch trees coming up through the loading docks, a whole wall of ivy on the eastern face, which sounds almost nice until you're standing in front of it at 9 in the morning, under a sky that won't commit to any particular color. Jerome stopped at the entrance, not the main entrance. He'd taken us around to a service door on the north side, a metal door hanging open at an angle because the upper hinge had given way. He looked at it for a second and then looked at me. Research team used this entry, he said. His English was good, accented but precise. It was closed when I brought them in, padlocked. I looked at the door. The padlock was on the ground about 2 meters away. Not cut, just there, open, like someone had a key. We went in. The ground floor was a production floor, or had been. Long assembly lines reduced to their skeletons, conveyor frames hanging at odd angles where the supports had corroded through. The floor was concrete, gritty underfoot, and the light came in sideways through the blown-out windows and didn't reach very far. Jerome had a flashlight, and I had one, and we used them. Louis stayed close to my left shoulder. William was on my right, which was where William always put himself. He'd done it in Karachi. He'd done it in Nairobi. I don't think he was even conscious of it anymore. Jerome led us to the stairwell without hesitation. He knew the building. I'll give him that. Whatever else he was doing, whatever else was going on behind those eyes, he knew every square meter of that place. The stairwell door was propped open with a chunk of concrete. Inside it was darker, the flashlight beams crossing and throwing wrong shadows, and I almost walked into William because he stopped short on the first landing. She was crumpled against the wall between the first and second floor. White hazmat jumpsuit, the kind with the hood down around her shoulders because she'd been working, not expecting exposure. Dark hair, maybe 30, maybe a little older, it was hard to say. She'd gone down with one arm extended like she'd reached for the railing and missed. I stood there for a second and didn't say anything. You see death enough, in enough configurations, and you stop having a predictable response to it. What I had was a kind of inventory. Okay, she's here. Okay, that's what this is. Okay, what else? And I was already running through it before I'd consciously decided to. William crouched. He was careful about it, not touching the body until he'd looked at it from 3 or 4 angles with his flashlight. He had a way of doing that, very methodical, very quiet, like he was having a conversation with the information and didn't want to interrupt it. Owen? Yeah, come here. I crouched next to him. He angled the flashlight at her throat. I looked, and I didn't immediately understand what I was looking at, which almost never happened, and I didn't like it. What am I seeing? I said. The tissue is distended outward. He moved the beam slightly. See the angle of the skin there. That's not compression from outside, that's expansion from inside. I looked at it again. He was right. The geometry was wrong for strangulation, wrong for any external force I could name. The skin at her throat was pushed outward, not inward, like something inside her had enlarged, like pressure building from the wrong direction. Something internal, I said. Something internal, William said, and he said it in exactly the same tone I'd used, which meant he wasn't confirming my understanding. He was just repeating the only words either of us had for it. He stood up, didn't say anything else. That was William. He'd tell you what he knew, and he'd stop at the edge of what he didn't know, and he wouldn't pretend the gap wasn't there. Stay tight, I said. We keep moving. Jerome was already on the stairs above us. I couldn't read his face in the dark, but he was moving fast, faster than the situation called for, and not in the way of someone eager to help. More like someone who wanted to be done with a specific room. The second floor opened up into a corridor and then into the lab, and I knew it was the lab before we got there because the door was off its hinges and the smell changed. Chemical, sharper, something antiseptic underneath the general rot. We came through the doorway and I stopped. The place had been taken apart. Not ransacked in the way you see when someone's looking for something. This was different. More like the room that had experienced a pressure event, like everything had been pushed outward from a central point. Sample containers in pieces across the tile floor, the shards spread wide. A steel shelving unit folded over on itself against the far wall. A centrifuge on its side with the rotor still in it. A portable field spectrometer that had cost somebody a significant amount of money lying in 3 pieces near the window. Louis went straight for the laptop. It was in the corner on a folding table that had somehow stayed upright, and the screen was still lit, running on battery, maybe a quarter charge left. He pulled a drive from his kit and had it plugged in before I'd finished scanning the room. Copying everything, he said, not looking up. Good. I turned around and Jerome was not in the room. He was in the doorway, standing at the threshold with both hands braced on the frame, not crossing it, and his flashlight was pointed at the floor inside the room, but his body was outside it. I watched him for a second. He wasn't looking at the destroyed equipment or the shattered containers. He was looking at the floor near the far wall. I followed his light. Drag marks in the dust. 2 parallel lines, consistent width. The kind of marks that happen when something with mass gets moved horizontally. They crossed the floor from somewhere near the center of the room and ended at the far wall, at a section of drywall that had been punched through from the other side. The edges of the hole were folded inward into the room, which meant whatever made it had come from the space behind the wall and pushed through into the lab, not the other way around. Jerome, he looked at me. When did you last? And then the sound started, from above us, from the floor directly overhead, a rhythmic sound, wet, with a weight behind each repetition that I felt more than heard. Not loud, actually not loud at all, which was somehow the wrong part of it. Something measured, something with a cadence. I'd heard a lot of sounds in a lot of buildings, and my brain went through its catalog fast and came back empty. And that was the part that made everything in me go flat and cold and very still. Louis looked up at the ceiling. William looked up at the ceiling. Jerome's hands tightened on the door frame. Nobody moved. The sound kept going. The sound stopped. Not faded out, not slowed down, just stopped. The way a machine stops when someone cuts the power. That immediate absence where a moment before there was presence. And somehow that was the thing that finally got my legs moving again. Because at least while it was going, I knew where it was. Louis had already turned the laptop screen toward the group. He didn't say anything, just angled it so we could all see, and I stepped closer and read. The files were research logs. Dated entries formatted like field notes, the kind of thing you'd recognize if you'd ever worked close protection for a scientific expedition. That same flat technical language people use when they're trying to keep their observations clean and separable from whatever they're feeling about those observations. I'd seen enough of it to read fast. Groundwater contamination beneath Reactor 4, that was the subject line on most of them. Microbial activity in the water table at various depths. Sample collection dates going back about 8 months. Readings that apparently meant something to whoever wrote them because they kept getting flagged and cross-referenced. I'm not a scientist. I don't know what half the terminology was pointing at. But I know how to read tone through technical language, and the tone in these logs changed somewhere around the 5th or 6th entry, got tighter, more careful, in a way that wasn't about precision anymore, but about something else. About not wanting to say the wrong thing in a document that might be read by someone who'd make decisions based on it. The final entry was short, a few lines. The researcher had isolated something from a soil sample taken 60 meters below the reactor floor. That was the depth they kept coming back to. 60 meters, like there was something specific about that number, some threshold the thing lived at or near. The words they used were symbiotic and aggressive. Not together, not as a phrase, but in the same sentence, which shouldn't work as a description of anything biological, but apparently did here. The sentence after that was half finished. Stopped mid-word, actually. Not mid-sentence. Mid-word. I stood there, looking at that broken word for probably 3 seconds, which doesn't sound like long, but it was long enough for my brain to do the full circuit. The woman in the stairwell, the throat distended outward, the hole in the drywall pushed through from the other side, the drag marks, the sound that had just stopped, and land somewhere I didn't have clean language for. Not panic, something colder than panic, the kind of understanding that arrives before you're ready to act on it. Jerome was already moving. He didn't announce it, didn't say a word. I caught the motion in my peripheral vision and turned to find him pulling away from the doorframe and heading for the corridor at a pace that was almost a run, and something in the set of his back told me he'd been waiting for that sound to stop. Like he'd been counting on it happening and had already decided what it meant. I crossed the room in 4 steps and grabbed his arm. He turned. And I've been in enough bad situations to know what fear looks like on a person. I've seen it in a lot of different configurations and a lot of different people in a lot of different countries. And what was on Jerome's face wasn't exactly fear. It was past fear. Fear is what you feel when you're still in the process of understanding something terrible. What Jerome had was the expression of a man who already understood it completely and had been living with that understanding for longer than was good for him. He didn't pull away from my grip. He looked at me, and then he looked at the ceiling, and then back at me, and he said very quietly, "It doesn't use its eyes." I didn't ask him what he meant. I understood what he meant. The drag marks, the hole in the wall, the way the sound had stopped, not because whatever was making it had gone somewhere else, but because it had finished whatever it was doing and was now doing something different, something that didn't make noise. I let go of his arm. "William," he was already looking at me. "First, move." William went through the doorway without a word, weapon in his right hand, flashlight in his left, moving the way he always moved when the situation clarified. Economical, no wasted motion, years of knowing exactly what his body was capable of and exactly how to use it. Louis grabbed the laptop off the table, tucked it under his arm with the drive still attached, and went second. I went third, and Jerome came behind me. And I remember thinking as I hit the corridor that the order felt wrong. Jerome behind me meant I couldn't watch him. But there wasn't time to reconfigure it, and at least this way he couldn't peel off without me knowing. The stairwell door was still propped open with the chunk of concrete. William went through first and started down, his flashlight cutting the dark below us. The body of the woman was still on the landing between floors, arms still reaching for the railing she never got to. And I made myself not look at her throat as I stepped past her because I didn't need that image getting louder right now. We were on the first floor landing when it came down. I don't know what I was expecting. Something that would announce itself, maybe. Something that would give you a beat to prepare. What happened instead was a sound from directly above us, a wet impact against the ceiling, and then a shape dropped through the gap at the top of the stairwell and landed on the landing below us between the first floor and the ground floor exit. Not fell, landed. There's a difference. Falling is uncontrolled. This was controlled, or something that used to know how to be controlled. The muscle memory of it, still functioning even if everything else had changed. It had been a man. I'm reasonably sure of that. The height was right, the general mass, the remnants of clothing still visible in patches. But the posture was wrong in more directions than posture is supposed to be wrong. The joints weren't where joints go. The head was angled at something that should have been a structural impossibility and wasn't somehow, which was the part I kept not being able to process. It stood, if standing was the right word for what it was doing, between us and the door, and it was still, and it was facing us. And Jerome had said it didn't use its eyes, and I believed him, because the eyes were there, but they weren't doing anything that eyes do. William had his weapon up before I'd finished the thought. "Wait," I said. I don't know exactly why I said it. Some part of me that was still running the professional calculus, still thinking about sound, and what sound would do in a building where we didn't know what else was listening. Some part of me that thought, if it wasn't moving, maybe it wouldn't. It moved. Fast. Faster than the size of it made any sense for, faster than the wrong arrangement of its joints should have allowed, and it was covering the distance toward William before I'd fully registered that it had started, and I stopped waiting. 2 shots. both center mass, or what was serving as center mass. The thing dropped. It didn't make a sound when it fell. That's the part I keep coming back to. No sound at all. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say. I looked at William, who was still standing, weapon still raised, and he gave me a single nod that meant he was intact. And I said, "Go." And we went. Down the last half flight, through the ground floor, past the skeletal assembly line frames and the corroded conveyors, out the north side service door and into the cold gray air of Pripyat, and we didn't stop running until we hit the street. We ran until we couldn't hear the building anymore, and then we walked fast, which is different from running, but not by much. Pripyat does something to sound. The overgrowth absorbs it, the empty windows scatter it, and after a while, you stop being able to tell how far away anything is. I'd noticed that coming in. Coming out, it mattered more. I kept my ears on the space behind us and heard nothing that concerned me, which should have been reassuring and wasn't, because the thing in the stairwell hadn't made noise either. Not when it moved, not when it fell. I kept that thought at the back of my skull and kept walking. Jerome was in front again. He'd slotted back into position without being told, which I didn't know how to read, whether it was professional habit or whether he wanted to be the one setting the pace and direction, and those are different things. Louis was to my left with the laptop tucked under his arm, drive still attached. William was on my right. Same formation as always. I checked William twice in the first 10 minutes, and both times he was moving clean, weapon holstered, breathing steady, nothing in his face that told me anything was wrong. I told myself that was enough. The streets were overgrown in that particular Pripyat way, where the asphalt has cracked and heaved and the birch trees have come up through it, and the whole thing looks less like a city than like a city-shaped idea the forest is in the process of correcting. Jerome moved through it without hesitation, same as he had on the way in, adjusting his line before obstacles were fully visible, reading the terrain like he'd walked it 1,000 times, which he probably had. I'd been impressed by it on the way in. Now I was watching the back of his neck instead of his feet. We were maybe 20 minutes out from the Jupiter factory when he made the call. He didn't stop walking. That's the thing I noticed first. He pulled the radio from his jacket pocket with one hand, kept his pace, keyed it, and started speaking Ukrainian in a low voice that was meant to not carry. It carried enough. I don't speak Ukrainian. I have some Russian, not a lot, enough to follow the shape of a conversation if the speaker is moving slowly and I'm not also trying to navigate a cracked street through an irradiated forest. Jerome was not moving slowly, but I caught enough. I caught the word for unit. I caught something that sounded like a location reference, a direction east or toward the east. I caught the word for done or finished, one of those, I'm not certain which. And I caught the tone, which was the part that mattered most, not reporting in the way a man calls his employer, but reporting in the way a man calls someone who has been waiting for a specific piece of information and has other people standing by to act on it. I didn't say anything. I kept walking and I watched him and I waited. The call lasted maybe 90 seconds. Jerome clicked off, put the radio back in his pocket, and walked for another 10 or 15 steps before he slowed. Then he stopped. We stopped with him. He turned around and he looked at me, and I want to be accurate about what I saw on his face because I've thought about it a lot since, and I think the word for it is anguish. Not guilt exactly, though there was some of that. Not fear, though that was there too. Anguish is the right word. The look of a man who made a calculation that seemed correct at the time and has been watching it become wrong in real time and cannot stop it. He said, "I need to tell you something." I said, watching it become. He told us that Hargrove Solutions had not hired him only as a guide. He'd been placed on the team specifically to report on what the research team had found, whether they'd successfully isolated the contamination sample, whether they were attempting to extract it, what condition the sample was in. He said there were parties involved who did not want the sample extracted. They wanted it contained permanently. He said the word contained in a way that made clear he meant destroyed rather than secured. He said a Ukrainian intelligence unit was already moving toward the Jupiter factory with orders to collapse the building. He said they had the equipment for it. He said they were probably already on their way. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt him because interrupting would have slowed it down, and I needed the full picture faster than I needed to express anything about how I felt about receiving it. That's a habit from the work. Let the information finish arriving before you do anything with it. It saved me more than once. When he stopped talking, he looked at me like a man waiting for a verdict, which I understood. He'd been running a secondary operation inside my operation. In other contexts, I'd have had a strong and immediate response to that. Here I was doing the math instead. I looked at Louis. Louis was standing with the laptop under his arm, drive still in the port, and he was looking at Jerome with an expression that was moving through several things at once: anger, confusion, the particular professional offense of someone who has been used as a prop in someone else's play. He hadn't put it all together yet. I had. Hargrove Solutions had hired a research team to go into the exclusion zone and investigate the contamination beneath Reactor 4. That research team had found something. The final log entry had used the words symbiotic and aggressive and had stopped mid-word, and somewhere between that last entry and our arrival, whatever they'd found had done to at least one of them what we'd seen done to the woman in the stairwell. And now Hargrove Solutions was waiting for us to come out of the zone with a laptop full of research files that documented exactly what that something was and how it behaved and what it had been doing in the groundwater for however long it had been down there. Whoever funded the original research had funded it because they wanted to know what was there. And now they'd know. And then they'd decide what to do with knowing it. And that decision would be made by people I'd never met in a boardroom I'd never see. And the only thing I was certain of was that none of the available options ended with that information sitting quietly in a drawer somewhere. The thing that had dropped from the ceiling in the stairwell had been a man. It had remnants of clothing on it. It had been a man who was part of a research team that had gone into a building to do scientific work and had, somewhere in the process, become something that moved faster than its broken joints should have allowed and made no sound when it died. That was the research. That was the result. And Louis was carrying the documentation of how you got there. Jerome was still looking at me. He said, "I am sorry. I want you to know that I am sorry." He said it in a way that meant he'd known this moment was coming, since before we left the checkpoint, and had been carrying it the whole way in and the whole way back, and the weight of it was visible on him now that he'd put it down. I believed him. That's the honest answer. I believed that Jerome Kelly was genuinely sorry, and I believed that being genuinely sorry had not stopped him from making the call, and I believed that the call had already done whatever it was going to do, and that sorry was now a word that existed in a different category from useful. I looked at Louis again. Louis looked back at me, and I could see him starting to arrive at the same place I'd already reached. The laptop shifting slightly in his grip the way things do when you become suddenly more conscious of what you're holding. The checkpoint wasn't visible yet. We had maybe another 15-20 minutes of walking before it came into view. I had that much time to figure out what I was going to do, and I already knew. And the knowing sat in my chest like something cold and dense, and I stood there for another few seconds anyway, giving myself the last of the time I had. I took the laptop from Louis without saying anything first. That part matters, I think. I didn't explain myself, didn't give him the chance to argue, didn't frame it as a question or a suggestion. I just reached over and took it from under his arm the way you'd take something off a shelf, and Louis let me do it, because the motion was so flat and deliberate that his body hadn't caught up with what was happening yet. The drive was still in the port. I didn't remove it. Didn't matter at that point. Jerome watched me. William watched me. Lewis watched me with his arms still slightly raised from where the laptop had been, and I could see the exact moment his brain finished processing the sequence and landed on what I was about to do, because his jaw tightened and he took half a step forward and stopped himself. I walked to the edge of the road, Chernobyl Street, or what was left of it. The asphalt had heaved and cracked into sections over the years, weeds and small birch saplings coming up through the gaps, and the surface had the texture of something that had been breaking apart for so long it had almost finished. I set the laptop down on a flat section near the curb. The screen had gone dark at some point during the walk, battery finally gone. I remember that detail for some reason. The screen was already dead when I put it down, which meant the files were sitting there, in the dark, on a machine that looked like it had already given up. I drew my weapon, put 2 rounds through the center of it, and then a third through the drive port specifically. The sound was loud, too loud for where we were. It bounced off the building facades and came back at us from 3 directions, and then the street went quiet again, and somewhere in the middle distance, a bird went up from a tree and didn't come back down. I stood there for a second looking at what was left. The casing had split open and the drive was in pieces, and there was nothing on that machine that was going to end up in a Hargrove Solutions boardroom or anywhere else. I holstered my weapon. Lewis shoved me from behind. Not a punch, not a grab. A 2-handed shove between the shoulder blades, hard enough that I had to step forward to stay upright. I turned around. His face was doing several things at once, the way faces do when someone is too angry to organize it into a single expression. He pointed at the pieces on the ground. "That was our proof," he said. "That was the only thing that made any of this mean anything. You understand that? You just..." He stopped, reset. "Hargrove doesn't pay without deliverables, Owen. That's how this works. You know how this works." I didn't say anything. "Our careers," he said. "That's what you just did. Not just this contract, all of it. Word gets out that you destroyed a client's assets on a recovery job, you are done. I am done because I was standing here and I didn't stop you." He was keeping his voice low, which took effort. I could see it taking effort. "I need you to tell me you had a reason." I didn't give him one. I'm not proud of that, and I'm not apologetic about it either. The honest answer is I didn't have language for it that would have satisfied him, and I knew that, so I said nothing and turned and started walking. Louis stood there for another few seconds behind me. I heard him exhale, long and sharp. The sound of a man deciding whether to keep arguing with someone who has already left the conversation. Then I heard his boots on the cracked asphalt falling in behind me. Jerome had not moved during any of this. He was standing off to the side of the road with his hands back in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the ground, and when I passed him, he fell in without a word. William was already walking. He'd started moving the moment I holstered the weapon, like he'd made his own assessment, and reached his own conclusion, and the conclusion was that forward was the only direction that mattered now. I told myself Louis wasn't wrong about the money. He wasn't. Hargrove would pull the contract, that was certain, and the word would move through the industry the way word always moved, quietly, laterally, through referrals and recommendations that suddenly stopped coming. I'd built 11 years of that network, and I'd just lit a portion of it on fire on a cracked street in a dead city in Ukraine. I knew that, I was walking, and I knew that, and I kept walking anyway, and I don't have a clean explanation for it. That doesn't sound like I'm performing a kind of virtue I'm not sure I actually possess. What I had was the final log entry, mid-word, not mid-sentence, mid-word, and the woman on the stairwell landing with her throat pushed outward from the inside, and the thing that had been a man dropping from the ceiling and moving toward William faster than the angles of its body should have allowed. I had all of that, and I had the understanding that the laptop was the documented path from the soil sample 60 meters below the reactor floor to whatever those people had become, and that path was now in pieces on Chernobyl Street, and whoever at Hargrove Solutions had funded that research was going to have to start over from nothing if they wanted to walk it again. That was the calculation. I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying it was the one I made. We were maybe 10 minutes out from the checkpoint when I heard them. A vehicle first. Engine noise coming from the north, moving at pace. Then a second vehicle behind it. I moved us to the side of the road and we stood in the shadow of a collapsed wall while two dark SUVs passed us going the opposite direction, moving toward the Jupiter factory at a speed that said they had a destination and a timeline and no interest in anything on the roadside. The windows were tinted. The plates were Ukrainian government issue. Nobody in either vehicle looked at us. They were past us in under a minute. Jerome was standing slightly ahead of me, watching the vehicles until they disappeared around a bend, and he didn't say anything, and I didn't ask him to. His radio call had done what it was supposed to do. We were cleared. Whatever arrangement he'd made with whoever was on the other end of that call, it included 4 people walking out of the zone unmolested, and I understood then that Jerome had negotiated. That specifically had made sure of it, had probably insisted on it as a condition. I didn't thank him. I don't know if that was the right call either. The Ditiatki checkpoint came into view a few minutes later. Same guard post, same gray light, same general atmosphere of a place that processes things and asks no questions about them. The same guard who had waved us through that morning checked something on his phone again, looked at the 4 of us, and waved us back through the other direction. No inspection, no record. We crossed the line and we were out. And then the movement stopped, and the stopping was its own kind of shock after everything that had been moving for the last several hours. We were standing on the civilian side of the checkpoint in the cold, and there was a vehicle waiting where we'd left one, and nobody was talking, and Lewis wouldn't look at me. It was William who noticed it first, or maybe he'd noticed it earlier and said nothing. I'm still not sure which. He was pulling off his jacket to put it in the back of the vehicle when the sleeve of his shirt rode up, and Jerome said something short and quiet in Ukrainian, and William stopped and looked down at his own forearm. A laceration. 3, maybe 4 inches, running along the inside of the forearm below the elbow. The skin around it was slightly raised, edges clean enough that whatever had made it had been moving fast. Stairwell, almost certainly. A piece of exposed rebar or a broken edge of something in the dark when we were moving fast and not looking at anything except the exit. It had gone through his sleeve without him feeling it, or he'd felt it and filed it away because there was no time to address it, which was the kind of thing William did. He looked at it for a moment, then reached into his kit, cleaned it with what he had, and pressed a field dressing over it, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this kind of thing to himself 100 times. It's nothing, he said. I looked at the cut. I looked at the clean edges of it and the slightly raised skin around it, and I thought about the woman on the stairwell landing and the final log entry and the word symbiotic sitting next to the word aggressive in the same sentence. I didn't say anything. The drive back to Kyiv was 6 hours. I know that because I watched every one of them. We loaded into the vehicle at the checkpoint without discussion about seating. Louis took the front passenger seat, which meant he didn't have to look at me. Jerome drove because Jerome knew the roads. That left me and William in the back, and I positioned myself at the window behind Jerome so I had a clear sightline to William's right side without being obvious about it. Fieldwork habit. You watch the person you're worried about from an angle that doesn't announce itself. William settled in, buckled up, set his kit bag between his feet, and looked out his own window. The field dressing on his forearm was hidden under his sleeve. He didn't favor the arm, didn't adjust it, didn't shift his weight to protect it. That was normal for William. He had a high threshold and a deep habit of just absorbing damage and continuing, so I told myself the absence of guarding behavior was a good sign. I told myself that for maybe the first 40 minutes. The road north out of the zone is nothing. Flat agricultural land, tree lines, the occasional village that looks like it lost its reason for existing around the same time as everything else in that part of the country. Jerome drove without talking. Louis had his elbow on the door and his face turned toward the window, and he was doing the thing people do when they've decided they're not going to speak until spoken to, and then they're going to say something that cuts. I left him to it. I had other things to watch. William talked for a while. Not much, but some. He made a comment about the road surface around the first hour, something about the patch job on a particular stretch being worse than the original damage, which was the kind of observation William made. Dry, precise, not inviting a conversation, just noting a fact, because the fact was there. I responded. Jerome made a sound that might have been agreement. Louis said nothing. That was fine. That was still normal. Somewhere past the second hour, William stopped. Not all at once. He didn't go quiet mid-sentence or trail off in a way that flagged. He just finished whatever he was saying. I don't remember what it was, something small, and then didn't start anything else. I waited for him to pick up again the way you wait for someone to continue a thought they've paused on. He didn't. I let another few minutes go. Still nothing. I asked him something about the route, some logistical non-question designed to get him talking, and he answered it in 3 words and went back to looking out the window. I told myself he was tired. We were all tired. The body does what it needs to do after an operation that goes sideways, and sometimes what it needs is silence. I'd seen William go quiet after difficult jobs before. It wasn't unusual. I told myself that. The thing is, I know what tired looks like. I've watched a lot of people be tired in close quarters over a lot of years. Tired has a texture to it, the small shifts, the head dropping and catching, the way breathing deepens and slows toward something that might become sleep. William wasn't doing any of that. He was just still. Sitting with his back straight and his hands in his lap and his eyes open looking at the window, and the stillness had a quality to it that wasn't rest. It was something else. Something more like the absence of the thing that makes a person fidget and adjust and exist in the small, continuous ways that people exist. I started watching his chest. That's not something you do consciously. You don't decide to monitor someone's respiratory rate. But somewhere in the 4th hour, I realized I had been counting his breaths for a while without having made a decision to start. And the count was slow, not alarmingly slow, not the kind of slow that makes you reach for a phone or grab someone's arm, just slightly too measured, like a metronome set 1 notch below where it should be, like a system running at reduced capacity in a way that conserved something or protected something or was just different. I thought about the woman on the stairwell landing. I told myself that was not the same thing. The woman had been inside that building for days, maybe longer, and whatever the log had been documenting was something that moved through a system over time, not something that happened in the back of a car on a highway outside Zhytomyr. I told myself the cut was clean, that William had cleaned it himself, that he was a medic and knew what to look for, that if he had any concern about the wound, he would have said so, because William was not a man who withheld medically relevant information as a point of pride. I told myself all of that. The word symbiotic sat in the back of my head and didn't move. Jerome asked once if anyone wanted to stop. Louis said no. William said nothing. I said no. We kept going. By the time the city started showing up on the horizon, the antenna towers first, then the density of it, the way the light sits differently over a place where a lot of people are, I had stopped telling myself anything. I was just watching William breathe and doing the math I'd been avoiding doing since the checkpoint, which was this. I had destroyed the laptop because I didn't want that information reaching people who would act on it. I had made that decision on a crack street in the exclusion zone, and I had been certain enough about it to eat the professional consequences and walk away from a career I'd spent 11 years building. And now I was sitting 18 inches away from the most likely vector for everything the laptop had been documenting and I was doing nothing. Not because I didn't know what I was looking at. I knew exactly what I was looking at. Crescent Street is wide and well lit, and full of the specific noise of a city that kept going while other things didn't. Jerome had navigated us in from the northwest, and we came onto it from a side street, and the traffic was the normal evening thickness of a major boulevard. Not gridlock, just the steady compression of vehicles moving through a city that has places to be. The light ahead of us went red. Jerome braked. We stopped. I looked at William one more time. He was sitting the same way he'd been sitting for the last 2 hours. Back straight, hands in his lap, eyes open, aimed at something outside the window that wasn't anything in particular. Breathing at that slightly wrong pace that I had been counting and recounting and telling myself meant nothing. I opened the door. I don't have a clean account of the decision. I didn't think it through in steps. I just opened the door and got out and stood on the pavement, and the light was still red, and Jerome said my name once, flat and questioning, and I didn't answer him. I closed the door. I stood there while the light held. Then it changed, and the vehicles around us started moving, and Jerome's vehicle moved with them, and I stood on Crescent Street and watched it go. I told myself William would be fine. I kept telling myself that. I was still telling myself that when the vehicle turned and disappeared, and I was still telling myself that later, and I never went back to check. And that's the only answer I ever gave myself about what I did on that street. That I told myself he'd be fine. That I believed it, or tried to. That the trying was enough. It wasn't enough. I knew that then, and I know it now. But I kept walking anyway. I kept walking. That's the whole of it, really. I kept walking, and Crescent Street kept going under my boots, and the evening traffic moved around me like I was a post someone had planted in the pavement, and I didn't look back at the corner where the vehicle had turned. Didn't see the point. It was already gone. I don't know how far I walked that first hour. Long enough that the main boulevard thinned out into side streets, and the side streets got quieter, and at some point, I was standing outside a place with fogged windows and the smell of fried oil coming through the door, and I went in and sat down because my legs had decided to stop without consulting me first. I ordered something by pointing at what the man next to me had. It came out hot, and I ate it without tasting it, and sat there for a while after, both hands around a glass of tea that went cold, the same way my coffee had gone cold back home on the Tuesday morning when all of this started. Funny, that, or not funny, just the kind of thing you notice when you've got nothing useful to think about and your brain is going to think about something regardless. I had 2 things I was holding, not examining, just holding, the way you carry something heavy in both hands when you can't set it down. The first one was the laptop. 3 rounds through it, on Kurchatova Street, the casing split open, the drive destroyed, a bird startled out of a tree. That had been the right call. I still believe that, or I believe it, as much as I believe anything about that week. Whatever the research team had documented in those logs, the path from a soil sample 60 meters below the reactor floor to the thing that dropped from the ceiling in that stairwell and moved toward William at a speed that had no business coming out of those broken joints. That path needed to stay inside the zone. Inside the building, ideally, which the Ukrainian intelligence unit was already handling by the time we cleared the checkpoint. I had done what I could with what I had. That's a sentence I've told myself many times since, and it sounds reasonable every time, and it doesn't help. The second thing was William. Left forearm, inside face, below the elbow, clean edges, slightly raised skin around it. Jerome had noticed it first, which still bothers me in a way I can't fully explain. Something about Jerome noticing before I did, when I'd been watching William for hours by that point, or telling myself I was watching. Mostly I'd been watching and then explaining to myself why what I was seeing didn't mean what I thought it meant. By the time we hit Kyiv, I had run out of explanations. The breathing. That's what I kept coming back to. Not the cut, not the silence. The breathing. one notch too slow, like a clock someone had wound down just slightly. Not enough to alarm anyone who wasn't looking for it. Enough to alarm me once I started counting. I hadn't wanted to start counting. You don't want to start counting a thing like that because once you have the number in your head, you can't unknow it. I sat in that restaurant for a long time. The man next to me left, and another man sat down, and he left too. And at some point, the place got quieter, and the cook came out from the back and looked at me in a way that was not unfriendly, but was definitely a question. And I paid and went back outside. The air was colder by then. I walked. Louis's words from Kurchatova Street were in there too, somewhere in the pile. He wasn't wrong. He'd been right about all of it, practically speaking. The contract, the payout, the referral networks, 11 years of built reputation in an industry where reputation is the only currency that actually spends. I had cost both of us something real. I knew that. I wasn't arguing with it. I just couldn't find a place inside myself that was willing to feel bad about it, the way Louis needed me to feel bad about it. Because every time I reached for that feeling, I ran into the woman on the stairwell landing with her arm stretched toward a railing she never reached, and whatever had been a man before, it dropped from the ceiling, and the final log entry that stopped mid-word, not mid-sentence, mid-word, like the person writing it had simply stopped being a person who could write. I found a hotel at some point, nothing notable about it, paid cash, which I had enough of, and went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, and I looked at the wall for a while. I thought about calling Louis, not to apologize. I don't think I had an apology in me, and I wasn't going to manufacture one. Maybe just to hear his voice and know he was still angry, which would mean he was fine, which would mean at least one of the three of them was fine. I didn't call. I told myself it was late. It wasn't that late. I thought about calling Jerome. Jerome, who had walked into that operation knowing what he was walking into and had spent the whole job carrying that knowledge with him through every collapsed corridor and overgrown street, right up until the moment he made a radio call that got all four of us out alive. I didn't call Jerome either. I didn't have his number, which is a practical reason, and I was grateful for practical reasons that night. I thought about William. I thought about William for a long time. The thing about not going back to check is that it keeps the question open. That's what I told myself on the edge of that hotel bed, and it's what I've told myself since. And there's even a version of it that's true. Not going back means I never got an answer I couldn't undo. Means I never had to stand in front of something that used to be William and make the same call I made in the stairwell twice, center mass. Means I got to keep the version of events where William cleaned the cut himself and said it was nothing. And maybe it was nothing. Maybe the cut was just a cut. Maybe the raised skin was nothing. Maybe the slowed breathing was fatigue, and the silence was William being William. And I was a man who had spent 3 days inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone looking at things no one should look at, and my pattern recognition was running hot on bad data. Maybe. I've had years to sit with maybe. It doesn't get more comfortable. What I know is this. I went into the zone to bring a research team out. I came out with 3 of the 4 people I went in with, and one of those 3 I left on a street in Kiev without a word, and the laptop that might have told someone how to help him was in pieces on Kurchatova Street because I had decided that the people most likely to receive that information were exactly the wrong people to have it. Both of those decisions made sense when I made them. Both of them still make a kind of sense when I hold them up to the light. That's the part that doesn't resolve. It's not that I made the wrong calls, it's that the right calls and the wrong calls turned out to look identical from where I was standing, and I made them anyway, and I kept walking. I left Kiev the next morning. Bus to the border, then a series of connections I don't need to account for here. I was back in my apartment by Thursday. The coffee I'd left in the pot on Tuesday was still there. I poured it out and made fresh and sat at the table, and the apartment was very quiet. Hargrove Solutions called once about 10 days later. Different number, different voice, same smooth, unhurried delivery. I let it ring. They didn't call again. Louis and I haven't spoken since Kurchatova Street. That's on me, and I know it. Some debts you don't know how to pay, so you don't pay them, and that's its own kind of answer. I never went back to check on William. I told myself he'd be fine. I kept telling myself that. I'm still telling myself that now, sitting here, talking through something I've been sitting on for a long time, and the telling is the only answer I've ever allowed myself, and it was never enough, and I kept walking anyway. That's the whole of it.